Well, hey everyone, my name's Pete Krause with Modern Cardboard, and today we're going to look at how to play Tindaya. This game puts you and the other players in charge of tribes in the Canary Islands during the Age of Exploration. So the job for you and the other players is to survive 3 eras of disasters the gods throw your way, and then invasions from conquistadors. There are 2 game modes in Tindaya, Alliance mode which is cooperative and Dominion mode which is competitive. The fundamental way the game works for both modes is the same, but obviously you get a quite different experience depending on which mode you play. For this how to play, we're going to just focus on the cooperative Alliance mode, but once you know that, you can fairly easily switch over and play Dominion mode by making some slight changes. Alright, so a game of Tindaya is played over 3 eras, and each era is broken down into 3 phases. There's the strategy phase, the action phase, and the end of era phase. Players must survive all 3 eras by meeting certain survival requirements and the special mission requirement to win. If they don't, they all lose. Before I get to the detail of these requirements, I'll give you a quick overview of the phases of the game. The first phase of the game is the strategy phase. During this phase, players develop a plan on how to survive the disasters, invasions, and other things that will occur at the end of the era. The plan can consist of how to produce and deliver the goods to appease the gods as shown on these offering cards, how to deal with invading conquistadors, and if the prophecies are revealed, how they can better plan to reduce casualties. The second phase is the action phase. During this phase, players then work together to carry out their plan. Players have a limited amount of actions to do things like develop technology, use their villagers and livestock to produce goods, use their nobles to create new settlements, deliver offerings, battle conquistadors, and then prepare your natives for the catastrophes and invasions soon to come. Finally, the third phase is the end of era phase. In this phase, you do things like feed and shelter your natives, and you also get assessed by the gods on the natives that died, the food you let go to waste, and if you met the requirements of their offering demands. Finally, the gods unleash their catastrophes, and the invading conquistadors strike. The intensity of the catastrophes, like tsunamis and volcanic eruptions, depends on how well you appeased the 2 gods. Muneba, god of the sea, who controls the intensity of the tsunamis, and Akoran, god of the earth, who controls the intensity of volcanic eruptions. Each god has a wrath level meter which decreases when you make them happy, or increases when you make them angry. This wrath level is significant because at its lowest level, only 1 ring of hexes will be damaged when a tsunami or volcanic eruption strikes. For each color the indicator advances, an additional ring of hexes is targeted. At high levels, these catastrophes can wipe out pretty big chunks of the map. Also, if your group lets this meter reach this highest destruction level, the game is over and all players lose. You can decrease a god's wrath if you meet their specific offering requirements for the era, and increase it if you don't. Be careful though, as you can increase the wrath level for Akoran when you have too much food waste, and increase the wrath level for Muneba when you let your people die from starvation or die from lack of shelter. Your people are precious to you, or are they? If players make it to the end of the 3rd era, then each tribe has to meet the following survival requirements. They must have at least 1 noble alive, they have to control 1 settlement, and by the way, a player controls a settlement if they have at least 1 of their villagers on one. They must meet the special requirements shown on the mission goal for the game, and players also have to meet the common goals where the tribes have to keep the wrath levels of the gods below the destruction level like we spoke of, and make sure the number of conquistadors in the map doesn't exceed the level shown on the chart that's on this area of the game called the wilderness. This we'll talk about more later. Also, as a reminder, players lose and the game ends early if a tribe loses both of its nobles or if the wrath levels of the gods reach the destruction level at the end of any era. Next, we're going to move on to setup, but if you want to skip over this, feel free to use the chapter markers at the bottom of your screen to jump ahead and see how this one plays out. Find your 8 map bases, all of your hex-shaped terrain tiles, the setup aid card which corresponds to the number of players, and we're going to set up for 3 for our game. And then find the raw material tokens which look like this. Map bases have 2 sides, one with a black volcano and one with a red-centered volcano. The red side adds a bit of difficulty to the game by placing volcanoes closer together, which makes catastrophes more damaging. But you can mix things up and play with some black and some red. If you and your gaming group decide to use the red side, just make sure to keep the quantities of red versus black even. So like 4 red and 4 black, or 2 red and 6 black, like we're going to use for our game. Put the red volcano bases together first, and make sure these shipwreck symbols from the red side face each other. Then place the rest of the bases on the table. There are no strict rules for how the rest of these fit together, just make sure that the volcanoes are not touching, and make sure that there's no pockets that look like this. Gather the terrain tiles as shown on the player aid card, and form a separate island of terrain using at least one terrain tile of each type in the island. The terrain should include the volcano on each base, but not cover the chasms nor overlap from one base to the next. I start my islands by placing one tile of each type on each base and then just go around all of the islands again, adding the rest of the tiles until I run out. Stack unused terrain tiles next to the map to form the reserve. Place a raw material token face down on each terrain tile. Clay raw material tiles get placed on each shore terrain, wood raw material tiles on each forest terrain, and then a yellowish mineral tile on each mountain terrain. Place any unused wood tiles back in the box. Then set the gray mineral tiles in the reserve. Find your turn order markers, tribe cards, settlements, tribe components, trade panel, and tribe panels. Then each player selects the color of tribe components, takes a trade panel, and places the tribe panel to the right of the trade panel. Then you'll determine a starting player and give this player turn order marker number 1, then give the rest to the other players increasing in clockwise order. Flip the player aid card over, and then each player collects the 2 settlements shown matching their turn order marker. These are the trades your tribe now knows at the start of the game. Each player then leaves the spaces open next to the trades they know on their panel, but places cubes in the spaces next to the trades they don't know. Place 1 cylinder on the cave space on the tribe panel, and then the other 7 cylinders on the invention spaces on your trade panel, except for the one that's shown on the player aid card under one of your settlements. Flip the setup aid card over again, and then each player places the cubes and cylinders shown on it on the action deposit in the lower right corner of the tribes panel. Sort your flat disk looking resource tokens and then place them in a pile next to your boards. Then find your 7 villagers and 2 nobles. Place 4 villagers in spaces 4 through 7 on your tribes panel, and then place the other 3 along with your 2 nobles next to your player board. In turn order, players randomly draw a tribe card and place this next to their board. Each player then places one of their resources in the deposit on the trades or tribe panel with the matching icon matching the initial resources shown near the bottom of the card. Next, since this card also shows a player's special skill, I recommend that each player look this up in the tribe card reference in the rulebook so you know what advantage your tribe gets for the game. Find the pieces of the Mount Tindaya stand, the wrath markers, offering cards, catastrophe cards for each god, event cards, dice, and standees. Assemble the stand, and then place a wrath marker on the second to the lowest space on the track. Shuffle and draw 6 offering cards, placing 3 face down in these 2 spaces, and then flip the top card of each pile up and remove the rest. Shuffle and draw 3 catastrophe cards from each god and place them in the appropriate side of the stand. Sort your event cards by difficulty level shown in the lower right corner of the card. 1 bar is the easiest, 3 bars is the hardest. Sort out just the cards from the difficulty your group decides on for the game, and then just sort these into 3 piles for eras. For our game, we're going to use the easiest difficulty, so since there's only 1 card of each era, I just stack them with era 1 on the top and era 3 on the bottom, and then place them on the stand. If you're playing with a higher difficulty than this, randomly select 1 card from each era and then place them in a stack like I just did. Put the unused cards back in the box, and the standees and dice go next to this stand. Gather the pieces for the wilderness stand, the goats, pigs, and mission cards. Next, assemble the wilderness stand to the alliance side with this symbol. If you were playing competitive mode, you would use this dominion side with this symbol. Fill each area with animals which equal the number of players plus 2. So for our 3-player game, each side gets 5. The rest of the animals form the reserve off to the side of the board. Then randomly select one of the Alliance mission cards and place that face up here on the stand. In turn order, each player places one of their 2 starting settlements on the map. The settlement placement is limited to their terrain types. The fishing settlements get placed on shore terrain, the herd settlements on mountain terrain, and the pig farms and crops get placed on forest terrain. When a player places a settlement, they take the raw material tile from the terrain, flip it over, and collect the reward in resources shown on its reverse side and place these in your deposits. So if I placed my fishing settlement on the shore terrain, I would collect the raw material tile and gain 1 clay resource for each player in the game, so 3 in this case. And then I put the raw material token in this matching area on my tribes panel. For a list of all what reward icons mean, see the reference near the setup section of the rulebook. After you place your settlement, place one of your nobles on it. After the first settlements are placed, players then place a second following the same steps we just saw. After the second settlement has been placed, players place all 3 villagers on their settlements, splitting them up any way they wish, like all 3 on one, or 2 on one and 1 on another, etc. Place 2 pigs from the reserve on each pig farm and 2 goats from the reserve on each herd. Gather the rest of the settlements, then the canoe tokens, wall tokens, and conquistador tokens, and place them next to the other reserves. Next, we're going to create the market by finding these artisan cards, lay the rest of these cards out like this, somewhere near the board, and this forms your artisan market. Now I'm going to keep this market along with some of the other reserves off on another table for the rest of this video. Finally, shuffle the prophecy deck and the idol deck, and removing all the cards from them with this dominion symbol, and place these near the Mount Tindaya stand. Roll one of the 8-sided dice and then find that volcano on the map. Choose a forest from that island and discard its resource, and then place a fort there, which you can find on the opposite side of the settlements. After that, place 2 conquistadors on the fort. And we're ready to play. So like I said earlier, Tindaya takes place over 3 eras, and each era is broken down into 3 phases. There's strategy, action, and end of era. So now it's time to look at each phase in detail. The strategy phase is the planning phase. The offering cards let you know what you must provide for the era to appease the gods. For era 1, Maneba requires 3 fish and 3 pigs. The quantity equals 1 per player, and a Koran then requires 3 figs and 3 pork legs. What? The event card lets you and your group know what events will occur at the end of the era. For our game, we can see that we'll have a Maneba catastrophe occur, as will be shown on our catastrophe card, a tsunami, an invasion by the White Conquistador ship, and a Koran's catastrophe that will be revealed on his card. The numbers at the top of this card show the order that the catastrophes or invasions will occur during the end of the era phase. But this is all you know at this point. After you and the game group examine the events, you reveal where that pirate ship is located. To do this, roll a die that matches the color of the pirate ship and place that ship on the chasm matching that number. If we had more than one ship and they both rolled the same number, they share the same chasm space on the map. There are a maximum of 2 additional prophecies players can reveal to show specifically where the catastrophe will occur and to show the specific catastrophe that Maneba and Akoran will unleash at the end of the era. When the game first starts, both types of prophecies will be revealed to the players, but during eras 2 and 3, these will only be revealed if you as a group supply the gods with the fire during the end of era phase. Fire is indicated by either 1 or 2 resource tokens that gets placed on this fiery hand, and I'll show you how to provide this during the end of the era phase. If there's 2 resource tokens here during the strategy phase, players reveal both of the prophecies. If there's only 1, then the player who supplied the resource chooses which prophecy is revealed. And then if there's none, of course, no prophecies are revealed. Any prophecy not revealed now will get revealed during the end of the era phase when the catastrophes come. Since these are revealed for the first era, we flip up the top prophecy card and place the standees on the board following the numbers shown on the card for that era. Tsunamis get placed on the chasm matching the number shown, and all other standees get placed on volcanoes for that number. So for our example, we place the Maneba standee on the volcano for 6, the tsunami gets placed on the chasm for 4, and then Akoran gets placed on the volcano for 7. If the event shown on the prophecy card isn't shown on the event card like this volcanic eruption here, then just ignore it. For the second prophecy, just flip over both catastrophe cards and then look these up in the reference at the back of the rulebook. For instance, Maneba's San Buradon, if I pronounce that right, catastrophe is going to hit Island 6, And this is a pretty big disaster where at the end of the era, the island actually disappears from the map and it wipes out everything that was on it. And then as we see on Akoran's catastrophe card, drought is going to hit Island 7, destroying all crop settlements and tribes on them. However, if you see these rings on the card, it means that you have the possibility to protect what is shown. In this circumstance, we can fertilize and save our crops by spending 1 manure resource per crop to be saved. So any tribe on the island may want to make sure that they have manure for the end of the era phase. So now that you and the other players know all the doom and gloom that's coming, make a plan and figure out how you're going to deploy that in the action phase and survive to Era 2. During the second phase of the era, called the action phase, each player in turn order plays 1 to 2 actions. Rounds of actions continue until all players pass. When a player's done taking actions for the phase, they flip their turn order marker over. Most actions are taken by either placing a cube or a cylinder from your action deposit in one of the spaces in this action strip at the top of your trade and tribe panel. And then a player can take a few free actions that aren't shown. Actions like develop and produce can only be taken once during the action phase, while the explore action can then be taken multiple times and is marked with this infinity symbol to remind you of that. Now the difference between playing a cube versus playing a cylinder is that the cube provides a single action and then it gets returned to this action deposit at the end of the era, and you can reuse it for the next era. A cylinder, on the other hand, provides a double action, but then it gets removed from the game at the end of the era. You can save actions from one era to another, meaning you don't have to spend them all during the action phase. And by the way, 2 additional cubes are unlocked if your tribe learns all of the trades, and then up to 8 cylinders are unlocked if your tribe develops technology or builds the cave. The actions available to you each round are develop and produce for each of the trades you know, explore, build a cave, and then there's a few free actions that we'll look at as well. So let's start with this develop action. Developing allows you to create an invention, which expands your production when you take the produce action we'll look at in a minute. It also gives you another cylinder to use when you take actions. You can only develop on the trades that you know, which again are these trades without a cube next to them. Alright, so when you develop a trade for the first time, you unlock what's called the complex good in the center row on your trades panel. And when you develop a trade for the second time, you unlock this non-perishable good in the bottom row. The complex good has to be developed before you develop the non-perishable good. To take this action, you place one of your cubes or a cylinder from your action deposit in this develop space. Then you pay the cost shown next to the cylinder by taking the resources from your panel and putting them in your reserve. Then you take the cylinder from this space and place it in your action deposit. And by the way, if you used a cylinder to take the develop action, you must take the action again if there is another good to develop and you have the resources needed to develop it. If not, you lose that second action. The produce action lets you produce goods to offer to the gods and feed your people, along with a couple other things we'll look at. Similar to the develop action, you can only produce on the trades that you know and only in the goods that you have unlocked with the develop action. To take the produce action, you place either a cube or cylinder from your action deposit on the production square of a trade you know that you wish to produce. You then produce the basic good, the complex good if it's been unlocked with the develop action, and then optionally you may produce the non-perishable good if it's been unlocked and you have the required additional resources to pay for it. The quantity of resources you produce for the basic and complex goods is based off of the requirements shown at the top center of those goods. Now this icon means you produce 1 resource per villager on the settlement type matching this trade. This one means you produce 1 resource per settlement matching this trade under your control. And by the way, we haven't really covered this one yet, but you control a settlement when you have at least one of your villagers on the settlement. And just to let you know, your nobles do not control your settlements. For this icon, you produce 1 resource per goat on a herd you control. These icons mean you produce 1 resource for each pig or goat you sacrifice, and that means you return it to the reserve. All of the production of resources is mandatory, except when it requires a cost for sacrificing your livestock. You're in control of how many or how few you sacrifice. I could optionally produce the non-perishable good if I've developed the invention to unlock it. This one is optional, however, as producing non-perishables converts your basic or complex resources to non-perishable resources, but it requires you to spend 1 wood resource. Now my copy of Tindaya shows this at the bottom of the non-perishable good, but production copies have had that move to show it up in this area. For instance, if I produce on the crop trade, I get 1 fig resource for each villager on my crop settlements. I have 2 settlements containing a total of 3 villagers, so I'll get 3 figs. Since the invention for the complex good is developed, I produce 1 straw and 1 cereal for each crop settlement I control on the map. And since I control 2 settlements, I get 2 resources of each. And then since the invention for the non-perishable good is developed, I can convert as many of my cereal resources into roasted flour as I want, but I must spend 1 wood resource to do so. So I spend a wood and convert these 2 cereal resources into roasted flour. If I had placed a cylinder in this production square rather than a cube, I would produce again on the basic and complex goods, and then I could optionally produce again on the non-perishable good. So after seeing all that, you may be asking the question, how do I unlock and learn new trades? So your nobles are actually the ones who can learn new trades for your tribe. The way you do this is you move them to the settlement of the trade they want to learn that's inhabited with natives who already know this trade from another tribe. They and those natives must be there at the end of the era for you to learn that new trade. And we'll see more on this when we cover it in the end of the era phase. The build a cave action allows you to build your second cave. Now you only have to build this 1 time and then it remains there for the rest of the game. When you start the game, you actually have your first cave built, and that provides shelter for your first 4 villagers. Now your second cave is what you'll need to shelter villagers 5, 6, and 7 at the end of the era when they're on the map. Otherwise they die, and that makes Maneba mad and increases her wrath, and we don't want that to happen. So to build a cave, you place either a cube or a cylinder in this action space, pay the cost with 1 wood, 1 clay, and 1 stone, and move the cylinder to your action deposit. Now you can build this cave before you have these villagers on the map. And by the way, nobles don't require a cave. The Explore action allows you to move your villagers and nobles around the map. It's an action where you actually get to take some bonus free actions once your villagers and nobles arrive at their final destination, or destinations. Also, as a reminder, the Explore action is the only action on the strip that you can take multiple times during an era, and that's noted by this infinity symbol. Alright, so let's start with the basics of the Explore action first, and then we'll look at how to use the Explore free actions. So to take the Explore action, you place either a cube or cylinder in this Explore space, and then you can move your natives, and that means your villagers and nobles, up to 3 land and or sea movements. And if you use a cylinder for this action, and are completely done with the first Explore action, you can move another 3 movements. You can use these movements to move this same villager or noble, or you can use them to move a combination of different villagers and or nobles. You can also group or leave behind your villagers or nobles with each of your movements. So for 1 movement, I could move this group of 2 villagers 1 terrain, leave 1 there, and then move this single villager to this space with another villager and noble, and then move this group of 3 1 more terrain, and that would be my 3 movements. Villagers have a few restrictions on where they can end their movement. They can pass through a settlement controlled by another tribe, meaning a settlement with another player's villagers, but they cannot end their movement there. They can, however, end their movement in a territory where there's no settlement, but there can be villagers and nobles from another player's tribe there. They can't end their movement in an empty settlement of a trade they don't know, and lastly, they cannot enter into a conquistador's fort unless it's part of a reconquest action with a noble, and we'll look at that in a minute. Also, if you remember, I said you could also move your tribes across sea with your movement. You can move a group of up to 5 of your villagers and nobles from 1 island to the next, and believe it or not, this only takes 1 point of movement. But it requires a canoe and at least 1 noble to be included with a traveling party, since only nobles know how to sail. To move across water, you embark on a canoe, travel in a straight line of hexes, and then you debark on an adjacent territory to your canoe, and it doesn't matter how many hexes of water you cross as long as they're all in a straight line. If there's no canoe on the space where you enter the water, you have to build one by spending a wood resource, and then that canoe remains in the sea hex where you left it, unless it's destroyed by some catastrophe. So if we look at an Explore example, which includes sea movement, for my first movement I'll move my villager to the same space with my noble. For my second movement, I'll build a canoe spending 1 wood and then sail in a straight line to this sea space adjacent to the island over here. I'll leave the canoe to remain in that sea space. For my third movement, I'll leave the villager and move the noble to the settlement of a trade my tribe doesn't know, but it's got a villager from a different tribe. That way my noble can hopefully learn a new trade for the next era. Now, like I said earlier, when your villager or noble arrives at their final territory as part of the explore action, they can do some additional free things that can help your tribe survive. If you split up your move and have your natives move to multiple spaces, you can perform free actions at each location with your natives. You can also have more than one of these free actions take place at the same terrain space. Some of these free actions both villagers and nobles can perform, and then some only nobles perform. So the first free action we'll look at here is the one to collect raw materials. So when your villager or noble ends their movement in a territory with a raw material token, they can take it and then receive the resources shown on the opposite side like we did at the setup. The resources go into the matching deposits on your board, and this raw material tile goes in the matching space on the right side of your tribe panel. Just beware though, there's a maximum amount of tiles that each player can collect in a game, and that's shown on this wilderness panel. For easy difficulty here, you can have a max of 8 of these, medium difficulty 7, hard difficulty 6. Also, a player may not take the last raw material token from an island. It just stays there. The next free action is the barter action. When your villager or noble ends their movement on a territory with another player's tribes, both players can negotiate the exchange of resources on a 1-to-1 exchange. You exchange resources in your deposits, but not your livestock or conquistadors in your prison. When you make the exchange, you just move the resource token from one deposit to the next. It's from the deposit of the good that you gave to the deposit of the good that you received. And then the other player does the opposite. The next explore free actions we'll look at can only be performed by your noble when their movement ends. Alright, the offering free action may occur when your noble ends its movement on a volcano hex. From the volcano, you may offer your resources and or livestock to appease either a Koran or Maneba. The goods that they're looking for by the end of the era are noted by the era number on the top of the offering card. So if we look at the offering card for a Koran, your group would need to provide figs and pork legs for the era. Now the quantity required is equal to the number of players. So since we're playing a 3-player game, a Koran demands 3 of each, and these can be offered by one player or a combination of players. If this card was face up for, let's say, Era 2, you would then need to provide 3 figs, 3 pork legs, and 3 salt for that era. And then you get the idea for Era 3. And as an incentive to contribute first, the first player to contribute at least 1 resource to each offering card receives an idle card. Now to make your offering, you move your resources from your board to the matching column on either offering card. And if the offering card lists livestock as its requirement, you take livestock from a settlement you control, move them to the reserve, and place a resource from your supply on the offering card for each livestock transferred. And as a reminder, if your group fulfills the offering requirement for a god, during the end of the era phase, you'll lower that god's wrath by 1. Oh yeah, and the part I love about this is that if you fall a bit short and don't have enough resources to offer, the gods gladly accept human sacrifice in place of any resource. So go ahead and throw them on in the old volcano. To do this, sacrifice one of your villagers from the map. You can sacrifice a noble as long as it's not your last, or you can even sacrifice a conquistador from your prison. So that's a great reason to capture them. For each human sacrifice, place one of your resources from your supply in any strip on the offering card. When a noble finishes their explore action on a terrain tile which matches a trade they know, without any villagers from other tribes, they can build a settlement, but they must first collect the raw material token, if there is one, and if these requirements are met, then they can take a settlement tile from the reserve and place it on the terrain. If you have one of your nobles end their explore action on a pig farm or herd settlement of yours with no livestock, even on the same turn you just built a settlement, you may populate it by taking 2 livestock matching the settlement type from the wilderness. That is, as long as there are 3 or more of that type over there. You're not allowed to exhaust the wilderness. By the way, in settlements with livestock, if you abandon it, your livestock runs off and returns back to the wilderness. This also happens in the event of a catastrophe unless the catastrophe specifically says that they die. In that case, then they get returned to the reserve. Remember, it takes a villager on a settlement to control it. If only a noble is on a livestock settlement, they keep the livestock from running off, but if a villager from another tribe finishes their movement on the settlement because they know that trade, they take control of the settlement. The next free action is Reconquest, and this is what you do if you want to capture conquistadors and remove their fort. The number of natives you move into the fort is up to you, but you must have at least one noble in the party to enter, and then as soon as you enter, your movement ends. To win a battle and capture the conquistadors, you must have at least as many natives in your party as them, and then you must use as many weapons equal to them. Weapons are noted on your player board with this sword symbol, and you'll see that next to your obsidian and then the antlers. To use these weapons, you place them in the reserve. So, for example, if I move my noble and a villager onto this fort with 2 conquistadors and end my explore action, I spend 2 obsidian and win the battle. Once you win, you just move the conquistadors to your prison and then remove the fort. Typically, you won't lose these battles unless you don't plan well or you want to become a hero that we'll see in a moment. So in the rare case that you don't have enough natives in your attacking party, or you choose not to use or do not have enough weapons, your villagers die and then your nobles die, but they leave the game. However, for each weapon you spend, you kill 1 conquistador, return them back to the supply, they don't get captured. If you kill at least 1, then you're declared a hero, and then you get 1 idle card as a reward. So that's all the free actions for Explore. Before we wrap up on the action phase, there's a few free actions that you can play as one of your 2 actions on your turn. First, you can play an idol that you obtained as long as it can be played during the action phase. The icons on the card let you know which phase it can be played. See the reference near the end of the rulebook for an idea of what each card does. As a free action, you can also discard an unplayed idol from your hand and exchange it for 1 unit of any resource and put it on your board. You can buy a card from the artisan market by spending the resource on top of the card, and then you place that next to your board and add the bonus. A couple of the bonuses you can get from these is a wall that can be used to protect one of your settlements from conquest and from some catastrophes, or you can obtain one of these vessels that gives you unlimited capacity for your non-perishable goods, which will make more sense during the end of era phase. And lastly, you can demote one of your nobles, and you replace them with a villager from the lowest number on your reserve. The noble leaves the game. Just be aware, you can only do this with 1 noble, because if you did it with both, you'd lose the game. So that's the action phase, where you carried out your plan that you put together during the strategy phase. Next, we move on to the end of era phase, where it's like you're getting graded on your performance. So the end of era phase has 9 steps, and these are shown up here on the top of the wilderness panel. We're going to look at each one of these in detail, but after you know them, I think you're going to be able to build out your strategy in this game a lot better and deploy it during the action phase, so you don't make the mistakes like I did during my first couple games. So step 1 is reproduce. During this step, you just add an additional villager from your reserve to each of your settlements with 2 or more villagers. Do the same with livestock by adding one of that type from the reserve to any of your settlements with 2 or more animals. Then check the wilderness, and if there's 2 or more animals in a section, add 1 animal of that type from the reserve to the section. For any fort where there's 2 or more conquistadors, place another next to them from the reserve. Step 2 is where you feed your villagers. Now each villager requires 1 ration of food to survive, and if they die, you increase Maneba's wrath by 1 for each player who had a villager die this way. There's a small heart next to the food that's on your trade panel. The number in the heart tells you how many of your villagers each resource of that type can feed. For example, 1 fish resource feeds 1 villager, but 1 salted fish feeds 2. Also, as we'll see a couple steps from now, there's a garbage phase that you need to be aware of when feeding your people. Otherwise, you'll have too much garbage left over, and then that raises a Quarren's wrath, and you don't want to do that. You can't keep perishable food with this icon from one era to the next, but you can, however, keep up to 3 non-perishable goods without them going to waste. For example, if I want to feed my 4 villagers, I could use 2 fish and 1 milk to feed 3, and then use a salted fish to feed the last one. Step 3 is a shelter check, which applies if you have villagers 5, 6, or 7 on the map. As we spoke of with the Build-A-Bear, I mean Build-A-Cave action, if you have your second cave built and villagers 5, 6, or 7 is on the map, they survive. Otherwise, these villagers die, go back to your reserve, and then you make Mineba mad and increase her wrath by 1 for each player who has a villager die this way. Step 4 is the garbage step we spoke of a bit when we looked at the feeding step. Players move garbage, meaning any perishable resource tokens with this icon, and any non-perishable resources which exceed 3 over to the garbage area on the wilderness panel. If there are more resources here than players, 3 in our case, you increase a Corrin's Wrath by 1. After this first check, remove as many resource tokens as there are players and check again. If there's still more resource tokens or garbage than players, repeat these steps again. Step 5 is where you check if offerings were paid in full. If your group paid the offerings in full, lower that God's Wrath by 1. If not, raise it by 1. Step 6 is where all the events for the era trigger. For eras 2 and 3, if the prophecies weren't revealed during the strategy phase, you would do so now and place the standees on the map as we did during the strategy phase for era 1. You resolve your events one by one in ascending order as shown on this event card. So for our card, we start with Mineba's Wrath. To resolve this, you unleash what's listed on her catastrophe card. So in our case, Mineba unleashes this San Borodon, and this makes the island where her standee is located disappear. And this one's pretty bad. You remove any nobles from the island from the game, you return everything else to the reserves, you even have to cover the volcano with a sea tile. The good thing is this island can't be the location of future catastrophes. The next event is a tsunami, and the intensity of this is determined by Mineba's current wrath level. In its lowest position, there will only be 1 ring of hexes that are devastated. Add 1 additional ring for each color level higher on this meter. Once you determine the area impacted, the tsunami wipes out the terrain tiles and everything on them in that area, including canoes. The only thing that remains are volcanoes and any nobles that were on that volcano. The next event on our card is the invasion of the Conquistador's white ship. Now to resolve this or any Conquistador ships, you first determine the island it's going to sail to, and this is always the nearest island. In the case there's a tie, it's the island with the most settlements, and if there's still a tie, the most natives, and if there's still a tie, the player with priority chooses. Next, the attack takes place at all settlements on the island. If there are no settlements on the island, then the attack takes place on a terrain which has its raw material tile, and the order of this would be forests first, shoreline next, and then mountains. If there's no natives on the settlement or terrain, then remove the settlement and raw material tokens. Place a fort there with 2 conquistadors on that space. If there's a wall in the space, then the conquistadors flee with no consequences. If there are natives on the space, then a battle takes place. To win the battle is very similar to a reconquest, but unlike a reconquest, neither of which needs to be a noble in this case. If there's a noble or villager from another tribe in this space, then they must use their own weapons. Also, similar to the reconquest is if you killed a conquistador, you lose and don't capture, but you're considered a hero where you gain an idol, and then only 1 conquistador gets placed on the fort. Lastly, from our event card, we unleash a Corrin's catastrophe. In this case, this is the drought catastrophe, and this destroys all crops on the island and any villagers or nobles on them die. The difference from the San Borodon catastrophe is that this catastrophe has protection option as shown by this ring on the card. And this one means that for each manure resource spent, you save 1 crop and the natives on them. The last type of event that's not shown on this card, but may be shown on an event card from another era, is the volcanic eruption. This works very similar to how the tsunami triggered, but instead of looking at Mineba's wrath level to determine impact, you look at Corrin's, and instead of removing terrain tiles from the game, you flip over terrain tiles to their mountainside, and then you fill in affected areas of sea with new mountain tiles as well. And then you place this gray background raw material token on each of these. Step 7 is to check and see if you survive and make it to the next era. For our alliance mode we're playing, each player must have at least 1 noble alive, and neither of the wrath levels must be at this highest destruction level. If you fail one of these steps, the game ends and you lose. Otherwise, continue on. Step 8 takes place at the end of eras 1 and 2, and this step is where you can create fire for the gods so they reveal one or both of their prophecies during the strategy phase of the next era. To do this, each player in priority order decides whether or not they want to spend resources needed to create fire. To create fire, you must spend 2 of any type of fire-producing resources, and these are noted with this fire icon. If a player spends 2 goods with this fire symbol on it from their board, they place one of their resource tokens on the fire hand. You repeat this again to see if your group places a second resource token on the fire. So when you end the step, you're either going to have 2, 1, or no resource tokens on the fire, depending on what your group chooses to do. Step 9 is our final step, and this is just a maintenance or cleanup step. So first, check and see if there's any new trades that you learn. If your noble's on a settlement of a trade you don't know with natives who do know that trade, then move the cube from that trade on your trades panel to your action deposit. After that, then you remove your cylinders from this action strip at the top of your board. Those get removed from the game. And then put the cubes from this strip back in the action deposit so you can reuse them again for the next era. Remove the event card to reveal a new one, remove the resources on any offering cards back to their owner's reserves, and remove the offering cards so the next ones are visible. Then remove Akoran and Maneba's catastrophe cards, but don't reveal the new ones yet. Lastly, hand your turn order token to the player on your left, and now it's time to start Era 2. So finally, if you make it to the end of Era 3 and meet the following survival conditions we looked at during the beginning of the video, you all win the game. Otherwise, you all lose. And as a reminder, the survival conditions are as follows. Each tribe has to have at least 1 noble alive. Each tribe has to control at least 1 settlement. Each player must meet the requirements as shown on this mission card. The wrath levels for the gods must be below the destruction level, and players must retain control of the islands. The mission we have for our game is that each player has to have at least 2 conquistadors in their prison to meet the goal. And to check and see if you retain control of the islands, you use the chart displayed on this wilderness stand. For an example of how to do this, for our 3-player game, we go to the 3-player row and then move over to the space that has the range of how many natives our group has on the map. And in this case, let's say we have 17 natives. This is villagers and nobles in play. So at the bottom of this column, we see that there must be less than 9 conquistadors on the map for us to retain control of the islands. Since there's only 6 on the map, we retain control and would win the game in this example if it were real. Alright, so that is how to play Tindaya in Alliance mode. Now remember, you can always check out Dominion mode, which is the competitive mode for Tindaya. You can look at the rules and they'll show you a few tweaks that you'll have to make, and that gives you a completely different experience to this game. So, thanks for watching, and remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.